Thank you, Rebecca. Emily, please.
We have
You
a light?
want to talk from here?
Yeah, I want to talk from here.
Yeah, okay.
Good morning. Well, this is going to be a third take on the Obama administration's disarmament policy. We heard this morning the U.S. perspective from Washington on this global problem. Yesterday, Professor Nacht gave us the Berkeley perspective on the Washington perspective on this global problem, and today you have the, or at least an Israeli perspective on the Washington perspective on disarmament. As you all know, President Obama committed himself to global nuclear disarmament in his first major foreign policy speech in Prague. Thereafter, I would say that mid-2009 to mid-2010 was probably Obama's year of disarmament. He put a lot of energy into this agenda, and he made some progress. And his priorities, I think, were very clear. First of all, it was New START. And New START, of course, was dictated by the fact that START expired in early December 2009. It had to be renewed. So this was definitely a priority. And, of course, Rose Gadamuller was very instrumental in that respect. There was the convening of the Nuclear Security Summit, which Obama did with great fanfare in Washington, D.C. in April of 2010. And then, of course, securing a successful NPT RevCon in May 2010 after two problematic RevCons in 2000 and 2005. At the 2010 meeting, the United States was focused on producing a consensus document. This was regarded as an achievement in and of itself. This is what they were going for, and it was achieved, although it came with at a price, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes. Obama was also hoping, I think he was very much hoping, for momentum with regard to the CTBT, and as we heard, that did not come about. In statements about arms control and disarmament at the time, curiously enough, dealing with the two major direct and pressing nonproliferation challenges, and of course I'm talking about the nuclear ambitions of Iran and North Korea, normally appeared, if at all, towards the end of the disarmament to-do list, which hinted at perhaps a lower priority that was accorded to these nonproliferation goals. But in fact, this was somewhat misleading, because if we look at the record, at least as far as Iran was concerned, Obama wasn't moving at a very quick pace, but certainly Iran was not off Obama's agenda. Quite the contrary. In October 2009, the administration pushed to secure the famous fuel deal with Iran that actually would have been a step in the right direction. It wouldn't have been the solution to the problem, but it would have been a step in the right direction as far as curbing Iran's nuclear activities. After this attempt failed because Iran rejected the deal, the first 6 months of 2010 were spent trying to garner the support of the permanent members of the Security Council, Russia in particular, for a new round of UN sanctions. This was achieved finally in July. New sanctions were put in place through the UN. Following the UN decision, there were unilateral sanctions that were put in place for the first time beyond, the United States and the EU. It included Australia, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. The end of 2010 and beginning of 2011, I would say, experienced some false starts with regard to negotiating with Iran through the P5+1 framework, which then became the major framework for dealing with serious about Iran. And in fact, maybe with a little help from Israel from behind, 2012 has shaped up as the year of seriously stepped up U.S. determination in confronting Iran. So in light of this priority, of this record, I think there's a question why, what explains the lower priority that was normally accorded non-proliferation goals on the overall arms control and disarmament agendas that were being discussed by the U.S. administration in this period. And I think the answer is that President Obama was strongly influenced by the double standards argument, by those that claimed that the nuclear states had to come with clean hands when they made demands of others in the nuclear realm. And I think Obama was trying to establish firm credentials in the realm of nuclear arms control so no one could accuse him of shirking his own commitments, whether CTBT, whether START, whether the NPT, while focusing only on violations of others. And somehow this was supposed to strengthen his hand in dealing with Iran and North Korea. And I think between arms control / disarmament and nonproliferation is very strong among the arms control community in the United States. And it was reflected in a recent op-ed that was written by Madeleine Albright and Igor Ivanov in December 2012. And the authors here argue that the U.S. and Russia can negotiate further reductions. They were obviously calling for new bilateral negotiations between the United States and Russia on the nuclear issue. They can negotiate further reductions in their nuclear arsenals, and if they do so, they will enhance the credibility of their diplomacy in mobilizing international pressure on Iran to refrain from trying to build a nuclear weapon. The problem is that this connection is a somewhat dubious connection. I don't want to say it's a false connection, but at least it's a dubious connection. Because the difficulties of dealing with Iran are not due to a lack of credibility in the P5+1 diplomacy. It goes rather to the very severe difficulties of negotiating with a determined proliferator like Iran. It's also difficult to negotiate with a determined proliferator like North Korea. And I think we need to take note of the fact that the P5+1, who are the major international actors that are negotiating with Iran, with the exception of Germany, are all nuclear states. So it doesn't really make sense, this connection between the arms control or disarmament agenda and the ability to better confront or more effectively confront the determined nuclear proliferators. I think the lack of conceptual clarity with regard to the relative importance of the pressing non-proliferation challenges that are posed by Iran and North Korea vis-a-vis the broader sort of arms control and disarmament agenda has had some negative implications. First of all, the importance that is attributed to the different arms control goals has clear implications in terms of allocation of time, energy, and other resources. So if there's a split effort, obviously there's also some split in the resources that are being devoted to each of these agendas. Secondly, if Iran had been clearly defined as a nonproliferation goal that was clearly embedded in the overall arms control and disarmament agenda, I think it would have been more clear that the United States at that time, I'm talking about now, more 2009, 2010, that the United States aims to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear state rather than thinking perhaps about how to contain and deter a nuclear Iran. As I said, this was true up until 2012. In 2012, sort of Obama put that issue to rest. But as you said yesterday, Professor Nach, where we heard about, how the United States wanted to deal with Iran was in the NPR, not in the nonproliferation or arms control agenda. Thirdly, when Iran and North Korea are not clearly defined as a key arms control and disarmament goal, I think there's an implicit message to other potential proliferators. For example, Syria. If the determined proliferators were referred to, it was always Iran and North Korea. What about Syria? There's a serious proliferation concern with regard to Syria as well. As you all know, Syria hasn't allowed inspectors in since the summer of 2008. But again, because of the way the agenda was being defined, Syria was not included as a clear component of that agenda. Finally, I think the global treaty-based emphasis of the arms control agenda, again, CTBT, possible talk about FMCT, NPT, reinforces the sense that states are being treated as seemingly identical entities. And I noted this in my remarks yesterday, and I think dealing effectively with Iran means recognizing that states are not identical entities. Today, in 2013, as Obama embarks on his second term, I think the question is, what is left of the key items on his disarmament agenda? He got New START with Russia, but this didn't really lead to reset in the bilateral relationship, and missile defense in Europe obviously remains a very sore point for the Russians. As was mentioned, there's some talk about possible launching of a new bilateral negotiation to further cut stockpiles, but this hasn't yet really congealed as of yet. There was another nuclear security summit that was held in Seoul in 2012, but not too much progress was achieved. And the lofty goal that was set in 2010, which was to secure all vulnerable nuclear materials within 4 years, is still pretty far from realization. And it's interesting, I think, that the final communique of the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul didn't mention Iran or North Korea, although obviously North Korea was discussed quite a bit on the sidelines. As for the NPT RevCon, as I said, Obama was able to secure a consensus document, obviously, but it did come at a price. And part of the price was the WMD free zone idea for the Middle East. And a few words on this conference. I think the administration is actually somewhat ambivalent about the WMD free zone conference or conference idea, and it has been from the start. In one sense, the idea is, of course, very much in line with U.S. arms control policy and Obama's new dedication to disarmament. But the United States was pushed in this direction actually twice by Egypt. The first time was in 1995 when it first came on the agenda in the special resolution on the Middle East. I'm sure most of you are aware of the history and how Egypt and some others pressed on the final day of that review conference. They were hoping for a resolution that would pressure Israel in a more determined manner. The compromise was to have this idea of a WMD free zone put on the agenda. I think we should all remember that this was at the time when the arms control and regional security talks were actually still on track, but Egypt was pushing for this. So first in 1995, again in 2010, and together with the fact that this was causing some tension in relations with Israel, I think this was tempering any enthusiasm that the administration might have had about this idea. I think it was pretty clear that the WMD free zone dynamic was not going to move to fruition without the United States committing considerable diplomatic resources to getting all parties on board. But with the deep divide in the approaches of the different states in the region on the very basics of what an agenda for this conference would look like, this was obviously not going to be easy, to say the least. And the raging turmoil in the Arab world from 2011, I think, made this effort look even more hopeless, at least for now. And so the U.S. announcement in November calling off the conference or postponing the conference was not a major surprise in light of these constraints. I think the administration is probably hoping to be able to demonstrate that it made enough of an effort in this regard, and that the blame is really due to difficult regional conditions, so that at the 2015 RevCon it will again be able to achieve a consensus document, but that of course remains to be seen. President Obama embraced a nuclear disarmament agenda, but I don't think that he could be considered a proponent of classic disarmament, nor was he really, I think, a global zero person. I think his approach was from the start that of a realist, in line actually with the classic U.S. arms control approach of the Cold War era. Namely, a desire to reduce the tensions and the risks that are associated with nuclear weapons while maintaining U.S. nuclear strength for deterrence purposes. Obviously, he said from the start, not in my lifetime, and we all know how old he was, and that the U.S. would be the last, not the first, to disarm. One could argue that Obama has woken up maybe even more to the politics of nuclear agendas. And if the costs and constraints of arms control loom larger than the expected benefits, I would say that he's probably not going to continue to strongly advocate a disarmament plan. He might feel that he's done enough to consolidate his disarmament credentials, or he might have come to the conclusion that the double standards argument is just another form of manipulation on the part of states that actually want their own nuclear weapons. But for whatever reason, I think he is today more focused on specific proliferation challenges. And so at the end of the day, from the very broad arms control agenda that he advanced in 2009, 2010, stopping proliferation in Iran and North Korea is likely to top the list of whatever is left of the disarmament goals in his second term. There was just a nuclear test, obviously, in North Korea, so that will keep North Korea, I think, high on the agenda. I think it's pretty clear that Iran is going to be very high on the agenda. Perhaps somewhat ironically, if Iran is actually stopped, this is probably the most significant contribution that this administration can make to upholding the NPT and avoiding a crisis in the nonproliferation regime. And as we would say in Hebrew, if this is achieved, dayenu, which means basically that would be sufficient, or we would be satisfied with that for now. Thank you.
Thank you.